Welcome to the Daily Horror Habit Podcast. I'm your host, Jay Krieger, bringing you daily reviews of currently streaming horror movies for your twisted pleasure. Be aware that these reviews may include mild spoilers. And as always, I hope you enjoy. In honor of its 40th anniversary, today's review is of the 1980 slasher classic Friday the 13th, which is currently streaming on Amazon Prime and Crackle. Directed by Sean S. Cunningham, Friday the 13th is set at the infamous Camp Crystal Lake, a summer camp scarred by a bloody past. Though despite the warnings from townsfolk, the camp is opened back up and a group of counselors prepare for the coming summer season. It doesn't take long for them to be systematically stalked and killed by a mysterious figure. Given my love of horror, I admittedly arrived late to the Friday the 13th franchise. My first introduction would be Freddy vs. Jason, which is not the best benchmark for gauging the series as a whole. I view that movie kind of like it being a superhero movie before superhero movies really kind of took off. And while I slowly worked my way backwards through the greatest hits of Jason Voorhees' past, the original had eluded me until pretty embarrassingly recently. I suppose it's easy to overlook the original. A lack of Jason Voorhees being the main pill that was pretty difficult for me to swallow, kind of having a flippant attitude, what's the point if he's not in it? But it ended up being a fantastic display of the timelessness of the foundation kind of that's formed around this franchise. And it does a lot of things and succeeds in a lot of different ways that sequels, as much as I enjoy them for different reasons, never really were able to capture again, unfortunately. Something that I really didn't appreciate until recently rewatching the original Friday the 13th was just how important the score is, the music, that classic track, that obviously, for a majority of people my age who were born in the early 90s, we grew up hearing that track referenced in lots and lots of different things, but we hadn't necessarily known what it was from. The reason that the music is so fantastic is that it essentially replaces the killer's identity, because throughout the film, all of these teenagers are being murdered in grisly and gruesome ways, but we never see the killer until the last 15, 20 minutes of the movie, which is part of what I think makes the film work so well. And since the killer isn't revealed, all we see are first-person perspective shots. We see their hands and we see a weapon, but we never get to see their identity. And the soundtrack, which was composed by Harry Manfredini, was very pivotal, I think, in a lot of ways. The soundtrack itself replaces the need to show a killer. Every time you hear that music, you know that we are in the killer's perspective. We're essentially hunting and stalking these teens moments before either impaling them with an axe or stabbing them with a knife or skewering them through a bed with an arrow. The soundtrack, it isn't the icing on top in a lot of ways. It very much becomes a character in and of itself. And this is further complemented by moments before a kill actually happens. There's no music. There's no music at all. So that way you can hear kind of the visceral impact of each mortal wound that's inflicted upon one of these teens who should have been doing a better job monitoring their surroundings and whatnot. But I think these POV shots are done in a really menacing way. And it feels like it's actually the killer's perspective. Whereas a lot of times with a lot of POV shots, it kind of just feels like a camera lingering there. Whereas we see the camera react as the killer would if they're seen. So if we're watching a teenager from afar and we're watching them and then they turn around and look in our direction, the camera shifts a little bit. So that way it's symbolizing the killer moving out of the way so they're not seen. And it really does become a character in and of itself. I will say, as far as that's concerned, I think that that's important because I was not a fan of most of the characters in this movie. With a lot of these types of slashers movies, a lot of characters come off as just kind of fodder for Jason, or in the later films when Jason's actually introduced. They are mostly fodder. They're pretty easily identifiable from different archetypes. Like there's the clown, the fool, the Joker, what have you. They're pretty bare bones and they're easy to identify, and there's not much past the surface level kind of examination of them. And that would be the same with this movie, just with the exception of one of the initial characters who's introduced, Annie, at the beginning of the film, who's easily the most likable. And so when she gets killed so suddenly and so early in the film, it actually is a little heartbreaking considering she's the perceived, I suppose, purest one of the characters. She's the only one that's friendly, who has none of these negative character traits. She's not a jerk. She's not the quote unquote, like the bitch of the group or anything like that. So her death is the only one that I really had an effect on me in the sense of like, oh, that character's been killed. Whereas the other characters, they're all pretty standard in most regards, and they weren't characters I was all that fond of. I will say the most notable obvious actor in this movie is Kevin Bacon. This was one of Kevin Bacon's first movies. It's his third movie, I believe. And not that he necessarily had a lot to work with. He doesn't have that many lines, and most of the time he has his shirt off making out or having sex. I mean, I guess he was brought on as like the heartthrob of the group. He is the character that gives us the best kill in the film, and also one of the best kills in any Friday the 13th film. I think is saying something considering the larger budget that all these films got. The further they went on, the more sequels we got, the bigger budget, the more resources that went into effects and gory kills and whatnot. His kill is when he's lying on his back in bed after his significant other is gone to use the bathroom after another lovemaking session. And he gets an arrow pierced through the mattress where the killer's hiding through, and you see it pierce his throat through the other side and starts squirting blood. And it's probably the most gnarly kill in the entire series. Obviously, kills get more technical, they get bloodier, they get gorier, but I think it's the simplicity of that kill that really, really stands out. And I mean, like I said, I have only seen the original twice. It still makes me squirm. I squirmed probably more on a rewatch than I did the initial time, just because you forget how subtle the kills are in this, and yet they're so gruesome and gory in a way that really capitalizes on practical effects. And I think for the most part, hands down, this is thanks to horror makeup effects legend Tom Savini, who did the practical effects for the film. If you don't know Tom Savini, I hope you become familiar with his work, because it's sent ripples through the industry, basically, of setting a new standard in terms of gore and what was possible. He previously worked on movies like Dawn of the Dead, Maniac, Creepshow, Day of the Dead, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, just to name a few. But he had a direct hand in several, but also the three strongest kills, most memorable kills in the film, which would be Jack's throat stabbed with the arrow, and then the kill at the end. Oh, actually, there's another kill where one of the girls gets hit in the face with an axe, and that when I watch older horror movies, a lot of the time, the subtle but super graphic kills that don't come off as being kind of cartoonish really, really stick with me. And this axe kill, I think, is a perfect example of that. And especially, it's one of the rare instances in the franchise where the camera really does linger a good amount and showing you this horrific injury that one of the characters suffers. Definitely later in the franchise, the MPAA ratings board kind of they get more involved. A lot of these things get cut, especially in the case of like one of the seventh sequel, The New Blood. Tons of gore and blood and kills were cut down to get the rating initially from an X to a R rating. And there's usually a lot of quick cuts from kills and whatnot, so that way they can move on to the next thing quickly. They show you a glimpse of it and then move away. Obviously, for people like horror movies, the whole thing's building up to a gruesome kill, so it's kind of like telling a joke and then taking away the punchline, which is not great. But I think in this, it really does a good job of highlighting a few kills in a way that makes them super rewarding, because there's another death in the film that we don't even see. It's just implied that they're killed and we see their body show up later. But I would rather the film have fewer instances of graphic kills, just so that way they become that much more memorable. And this is something that the original does better than any of the sequels, I think. The other thing is that I enjoy a lot of the sequels of Friday the 13th. They're not necessarily tense or frightening in a lot of ways. I think it's more, I enjoy the character Jason. I enjoy seeing the punishment that gets dealt to him, and he keeps getting back up and coming back and doing the same horrific things to teenagers in some new creative ways. And again, the creativity of all the kills is definitely why I kept coming back and seeing the ways that the film evolved since the original. I mean, he ends up in space in Jason X. It's just like trying to I miss not having an opportunity to grow up when these movies were coming out, because then you could kind of try to guess what was going to happen in the next one. Like, what kind of insanity will they introduce? Is it going to be another instance of Jason isn't really the killer? Is Jason even going to be in it? Is he going to go to space? The more creative the films got, they kind of moved away from what the original was, which was this very tense, it's a slasher, but at the same time, it is very much a mystery. And that is, you don't know who the killer is until the last 15 or 20 minutes of the film, which I love. This is the sole instance in the franchise where it is a true mystery. You have no idea. Anything past Friday the 13th, part 2, part 3, all the way up to the remake, you know who's going to be the killer. You know who's behind everything. You know what to expect to a certain degree. Just because it's a new setting, you still have the same kind of plot beats. Jason is back. He's hunting a group down. He's going to dismember them in creatively despicable ways, which is fine. But I can't see them ever doing a Friday the 13th that has you guessing until the end who the killer is. And now, this is where some people might say, when Pamela Voorhees, his mother, is introduced as the killer, well, how would we know that she was the killer? Nothing was ever introduced. We were never given any breadcrumbs. The only thing that we know is about Camp Crystal Lake is that a young boy drowned, and they had 2 deaths back in the day. 2 counselors were brutally murdered. But we don't know anything about Pamela Voorhees. We don't know that she's the mother of Jason. So when she's introduced, and she's famously played by Betsy Palmer, we have no expectation for her being an evil character. How could we have guessed about her when we didn't know she existed prior to this? For me, I really love that. I love that at the end of the movie, it doesn't matter that we don't know who she is because it all makes sense. Her motives are very much influenced by the little amount of information that we have about the crimes that occurred at Camp Crystal Lake. And for me, I really love that, especially for 1980, that they subvert our expectation that the killer is male. I don't know about you, the entire time I'm watching, it never dawned on me that, oh, this isn't a man. Why would I assume that it's a woman? Especially not just the time period, but it's kind of just the style of slashers in general. We don't have a lot of female serial killers in these movies. So to add that on top of it being something that's very unexpected, on top of not being able to guess who the killer actually is, really worked for me in a unique way that I don't think a lot of slashers generally do. And I have to talk about and just give tons of praise to Betsy Palmer for this role because her character essentially comes out of nowhere. And yet she elevates the tension and the terror to another level. Generally in a lot of horror movies, for me especially, in the third act of a horror movie is typically the weakest part. The monster, the killer's been revealed. We've been seeing them. So the scares just are not as impactful. Friday the 13th is brilliant in the fact that the third act is so strong because we haven't seen the killer up until now. We've seen their perspective, we've seen the things that they've done, but we've never seen the killer themselves. So this idea that this new killer is introduced, and when she's initially introduced, we don't even know that she's a killer. We just think she's a woman that showed up that's looking to help out the counselors. So when it's revealed that she is the killer, it's even more frightening. This perfectly normal looking woman has been killing all of these teens and all of these counselors in horrific fashion. And she looks completely normal. She's not covered in scars. She doesn't have this wild look in her eye initially. She builds up into being pretty intense and pretty terrifying very quickly. But initially, she's very unassuming. This is somebody you'd see in the supermarket. This is somebody you'd see at the post office. This is not the killer that we would all assume her to look like. So in that, it makes her very, very ominous. And it shows just because she's unassuming doesn't mean that she's not deadly, she's not calculated, and she won't fucking kill you. And I think reading into a lot of her dialogue based on the way she looks also really makes it that much more terrifying. Initially, Pamela Voorhees wants to go investigate the bodies, and the last survivor goes, oh, don't go in there, he'll kill you. And she goes, I'm not afraid. And she just walks in. Initially, that's something that comes off as being like, well, that's weird. Or someone would say, well, that's crappy writing. What do you mean you're not afraid? You're about to get a machete in the face, just like the last, or a fire axe in the face, just like the last counselor. But when you realize that she's the killer, and especially once you see her go from that instance of being perfectly normal to getting ramped up and remembering what happened to Jason and to telling the audience essentially that these teenagers were not paying attention and that her son ended up dying as a result of that. And she gets more and more and more worked up. And then she starts echoing Jason's voice. She does that child's voice, which she uses to lure a counselor earlier in the film before killing them. She uses that voice and she starts, kill her, mommy, kill her, that kind of voice. You're just like, holy shit, this woman has fucking lost it. And again, for a movie that is now 40 years old, that scene is as terrifying as ever. There's nothing about that scene that comes off as cheesy, that comes off as, again, it's just her unassuming presentation, and that she comes out of nowhere and you think, oh, this is somebody that couldn't possibly cause harm to anybody. And then you see just how much she's lost it. It's terrifying. It's a fantastic performance. I think had the film gone literally any other route, it would not be nearly as memorable as it is today. And again, I don't know why they didn't include Jason originally. I guess they hadn't really envisioned the franchise to go in that direction, because the first Friday the 13th movie could not be any more different than the sequels, for better and worse in a lot of ways. But I think that if it did not have that performance from Betsy Palmer, and then eventually her horrific decapitation, which again, shouts out to Tom Savini because that's one of the most memorable kills in the movie, it just makes for something that is far more brutal, and it captures a lot of what I love about the original Halloween. The original Halloween, it's set in a perfectly normal suburban community. Friday the 13th takes place at a summer camp, perfectly unassuming, perfectly normal. And yet these horrific events happen. And what I like, I don't think that Friday the 13th does a lot of things better than the original Halloween, but it certainly captures the brutality of the killer and the gruesomeness of the effects and the kills in a way that Halloween does not. That's not a knock against Halloween. It's just an element of Friday the 13th that I think capitalizes on the framework of Halloween in a lot of ways. Because this movie was a reaction to Halloween. Halloween was, in essence, the basis for slashers like Friday the 13th and for slashers that would come for the next 30, 40 years. But I just think that had this film ended in a traditional route, it's just some guy. I mean, most of the film we're led to believe, or I would assume most people would think, Crazy Ralph, the town vagrant, who they actually find in a cupboard in Camp Crystal Lake, is the killer. Because he's crazy, he's old. Most people would probably assume that. I assumed that the first time I watched it. But to be introduced with something that's so drastically different and you couldn't guess it, I just love that. That's something that not many slashers do. Majority of slashers, or horror movies in general, you can guess who the killer is pretty quickly. Now, that works sometimes and sometimes it doesn't. I personally get annoyed when they're so heavy-handed in hinting at who the killer is that I get annoyed by the end of the film because I've solved it, essentially. So to be presented with a character that has a basis for what they're doing, and then they're just kind of dropped out of the sky, I love that surprise. I love not being able to guess their involvement. And at the end of the day, my not being able to guess who the killer is doesn't take away from the fantastic POV shots. It doesn't take away from the fact that we're being subverted in the fact that everybody assumes it's a male. It's a female for, again, the era. That's unheard of almost. What I also love is that the brutality of the kills, they're not lessened to any degree because it's a female. Again, playing against that kind of slasher stereotype that the killer's always a male. That's why the kills are so brutal and whatnot. That's not the case. Women can be just as deadly as men in this genre and whatnot. And it really does pave a new avenue for slashers that helped evolve the genre in a way that is definitely for the better. This is a good time to introduce a new segment to the podcast called Facts I Learned Moments Before Recording This Episode. So here are just some rapid-fire facts that I found while doing some research. Friday the 13th was the first independent slasher film to be acquired by a major motion picture studio. That's pretty crazy, but again, it's not all that unbelievable considering how successful Halloween was. I think every single studio was looking at not only horror, but independent horror in a way that they hadn't before Halloween. Getting to see the results of a movie that's made by essentially, at that period, a nobody on a shoestring budget and made it one of the best movies ever made, I think was something that every studio wanted to happen at their studio. So that's not surprising that they saw the potential of Friday the 13th and then they kind of jumped all over it. Friday the 13th also had an international release, which was unusual given it was an indie film and had almost no billable actors. Kevin Bacon is a massive name now. It's the whole 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon business. Everybody knows Kevin Bacon. Everybody's seen him in at least one movie. This was his third movie when this movie was released. Nobody knew who the hell he was. So no, he wasn't on there. And Betsy Palmer would be probably the second most known person, but she was on TV. She wasn't a movie star. So you could include her name, I guess, in the bill in terms of like the poster and marketing materials, but I don't know how much that resonates with a film audience or with young people for that matter. I'm guessing if she was a TV star, she was probably on older sitcoms or something to that effect that I don't think a lot of kids that were going to see Friday the 13th were necessarily watching. Betsy Palmer actually wanted to develop more of a backstory for Pamela Voorhees, which I think is fascinating. At the same time, I'm glad that most of it's not included because it would feel probably pretty unnecessary and bogged down. But I love the method acting approach and it really came out in her performance that she believed she was this character. She embodied this character so well. And the backstory she developed was that her hatred of teens was not only for killing Jason or for not paying attention to Jason and he drowned, but she had Jason out of wedlock with a high school boyfriend, and her parents ultimately disowned her for her sins because that isn't something that good girls do. So this idea that she had a child out of wedlock, her parents shunned her for it, she feels the trauma and the stigmatization from that. So that's part of why she kind of targets promiscuous teens. I really like that she was so involved in the character that she made up a backstory and that it came out in her performance in a certain way. But they didn't necessarily have to fill up more exposition. As it is, Friday the 13th, this woman is killing people, getting revenge because they weren't paying attention to her son, and her son died. Simple, straightforward. You don't have to dig more into it than that. And you get a fantastic result, and the film is pretty well paced considering a majority of the other sequels, they take like 45 minutes to get going and half the movie to get started. But that's a topic for another day. And then my last fact is apparently originally when this film was being penned, it was penned under the name Long Night at Camp Blood, which just does not roll off the tongue nearly as well. So I'm glad that they cut that down to the very simplistic Friday the 13th, which again, it's a title that captivates the audience and it immediately gives them an idea of what they're in store for. So again, simple and sweet. But yeah, this was a film that I did not appreciate fully until very recently, which is not great. But at the same time, it's a film that now anybody that says, oh, hey, I'm interested in kind of exploring the classic roots of slashers or horror films in general, Friday the 13th easily makes my list. But that's going to do it for the second episode of Daily Horror Habit. I will see you guys tomorrow for another horror movie review. Thank you for listening to the Daily Horror Habit podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe on your desired podcast platform or follow @Daily Horror Habit on Twitter and Instagram. Thanks for listening.